Consider something you have never once questioned, something so woven into the fabric of your existence that to examine it feels almost absurd. You have a birth certificate. Your parents have one. Your grandparents almost certainly. And for most of us, that document feels as instinctive as breathing, proof that you exist, proof that you matter, proof that the world was forced to acknowledge the moment you arrived. We carry it to the DMV, to the passport office, to the Social Security Administration. We treat it like a sacred birthright handed down from the universe itself. But here is the devastating truth. For the overwhelming majority of human history, thousands of years of civilization, empire, conquest, trade, and governance, nobody needed one. Not a single soul walked this earth required to prove their own birth. And then, within the span of roughly 2 decades, at the turn of the 20th century, nearly every industrialized nation on Earth decided that they did. All of them, simultaneously, as if following instructions they had received from somewhere they could not name. That is where I had to start asking questions. Go back with me, not to some primitive, chaotic world, but to a world that functioned, remarkably, sometimes brilliantly, without state-issued identity documents for individual citizens. Ancient Rome cataloged its people, yes, but that was census data, household data, property data. The household mattered, the family unit mattered, not the individual body, not the individual breath, not the precise moment of emergence into the world as a time-stamped, numbered event. Medieval Europe leaned on parish records, church documents kept by clergy, tracking baptisms, marriages, deaths, but these were not government instruments, they were ecclesiastical ones. The church knew you existed, the state largely trusted the church's accounting. And critically, you did not carry them. You were never required to produce them simply to function inside your own society. This forces a simple but devastating question. If enormous civilizations, the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the British Empire at its absolute height, could govern millions of human beings without issuing each one a numbered identity document at birth, what changed? What did the state suddenly and urgently need to know that it had never needed to know before? The deeper I followed this question, the more the standard answers began to feel hollow. We are told it was about public health, tracking infant mortality, understanding disease patterns, improving maternal care. And yes, those things happened. Those things are real. But they do not explain the scale of what was constructed. They do not explain the infrastructure that followed. They do not explain why a document created, supposedly for health statistics, became the foundational credential of legal personhood across the entire modern world. That is precisely where the official explanation begins to fracture. In the United States, the federal push for standardized birth registration began in earnest around 1902, when the Census Bureau established a birth registration area, a voluntary system, where states demonstrating a 90% registration rate would be recognized as compliant. By 1915, only 10 states and the District of Columbia had joined. By 1933, just 31 years later, every single state in the Union had complied. 31 years for an entire nation to fundamentally restructure how it accounted for every human being born within its borders. Now sit with what else was unfolding inside those same 31 years. The Federal Reserve was created in 1913. The federal income tax, ratified through the 16th Amendment, also 1913. Social Security would arrive in 1935, requiring, of course, a verifiable record of birth. The draft registration of World War I, 1917, demanded documentation of age and citizenship. And somewhere buried in the middle of all of this upheaval, the birth certificate quietly became the master key, the root document, the foundational thing from which all other legal identity would grow. Not coincidence, not accident, not the natural, gentle evolution of a compassionate society. The pattern was assembling itself with unsettling, almost mechanical precision. And here is where it grows stranger still. It was not just America. Britain's General Register Office, established in 1837, began mandatory civil registration of births, but it took until the early 20th century for enforcement mechanisms to give those records real legal power. France, Germany, Australia, Canada, all of them moving within the same compressed historical window toward the same architecture, the same logic, the same system. Different nations, different governments, different languages, but an identical blueprint, as though every government on Earth had received the same memo and simply never shown it to their citizens. Here is where I must introduce something that most people find either fascinating or deeply personally unsettling. In legal theory, there is a distinction, a foundational, critical distinction, between a person and a human being. In ordinary speech, those words are synonyms, but inside the architecture of law, they are not the same thing at all. A human being is a biological fact. You are born, you breathe, you exist. That requires no legal determination. That is simply what happens when life enters the world. A person, in the legal sense, is an entity formally recognized by the state as carrying rights, responsibilities, and, crucially, obligations. Corporations are legal persons. Municipalities are legal persons. The word itself descends from the Latin persona, the mask worn by actors in Roman theater, the face presented to the world, the role performed within the system. And what the birth certificate appears to do, what the deeper I searched, the more it seemed deliberately designed to do, is manufacture that legal person. At the moment of registration, a record is generated, a numbered document, and that document does not simply describe you. In the eyes of the state, it may in some profound functional sense constitute you, at least the version of you the government is legally authorized to interact with. Before 1902, before the registration systems, before the numbered certificates, what was the relationship between the individual and the state? Was it different in ways we've been conditioned to forget? Let me walk you through what a birth certificate actually makes possible. Not what we're told it makes possible. A sense of identity, a connection to heritage, a record of our origins. What it structurally enables at the level of systems. It enables taxation, not in the crude sense that the government knows you exist, but in the precise administered sense that it can assign you a number and come looking for you specifically. Not your father's household, not your family's land. You, the individual unit. The Social Security number, now issued practically from the hospital, flows directly from birth registration, and that number is how the IRS knows exactly which human being it is entitled to collect from for the entirety of their working life. It enables conscription. When the American government needed to draft millions of men into the First World War, and then again into the Second, it needed verifiable records of age and citizenship at a scale and speed that no scattered collection of church archives could have managed. The birth certificate made mass mobilization administratively possible in a way nothing before it had. It enables benefit administration, education enrollment, welfare systems, Medicare, Social Security. Every single one of these systems initiates with the birth certificate as the foundational document. Before you can receive anything from the state, you must first be legible to the state, and legibility begins at birth registration. And it enables tracking, not necessarily in some sinister surveillance state sense, though that question is absolutely worth sitting with, but in the plain administrative sense, where you are, who you are, what name you carry, what status you hold. Marriage records link to birth records. Death records close the loop. Property records in many jurisdictions trace their route back to the identity documents that began with the birth registration. The birth certificate isn't the record of a life. It is the opening entry in a ledger that will follow that life from its first breath to its last. Once you see it that way, you cannot unsee it. There is one more thread, and I've been circling it deliberately because it is the hardest to say plainly without sounding like I've lost my mind. But I've done the reading, I've followed the citations, and I am no longer willing to leave it unspoken. What if the document doesn't just represent you to the state? When governments issue bonds, when they borrow against future productivity, future tax revenue, future economic output, they need collateral, something real, something that will, with reasonable certainty, generate economic value over time. And in the early 20th century, precisely as birth registration systems were being universalized across the industrialized world, governments were also expanding their capacity to borrow on an unprecedented scale, backed by the projected productivity of their populations. The deeper I went into this, the more a single question kept resurfacing, insistent and uncomfortable. Is the registered citizen, the legal person, the numbered entity, functioning in some structural sense as that collateral? Not the human being, not the breathing, living, dreaming person, but the legal fiction attached to them at birth, the persona, the mask. I cannot prove that. I want to be clear about the limits of what I can demonstrate. But I can tell you this, the pattern is there. Registration, numbering, bonding, taxation, debt, all of it building, decade by decade, system by system, into an interlocking architecture where the state's financial machinery and its citizen registration machinery evolved in near perfect parallel. Not separately, not independently, together, as if they were always meant to be two faces of the same structure. And when I went looking for where that parallel is formally acknowledged in policy documents and legislative records, in the public discourse of the era, the silence was total, not contested, not debated and dismissed, simply absent, as if the question had never been asked, as if it were somehow understood by those doing the building that it should not be asked. That silence may be the most revealing thing of all. When systems this large are constructed, there's usually a visible transition, a period of overlap, of friction, of public reckoning. You can find the debates about the Federal Reserve. They were fierce and documented. You can find the arguments over the income tax. They consumed Congress for years. You can find the philosophical literature on the expansion of state power in almost every domain of 19th and 20th century life. But the deeper philosophical question about birth registration, the one about what it means, morally, politically, existentially, to hand the government the authority to record your child's first breath as a numbered entry in an administrative ledger, that question appears almost entirely to have gone unasked in the mainstream discourse of the era. Not suppressed, not censored, simply not raised. The public health advocates wrote about infant mortality. The statisticians wrote about demographic data. The census officials wrote about the practical benefits of universal registration. And all of that is real and documented and largely true. But the deeper question, the one about what it means to convert a living human being into a legal entity at the moment of their birth, before they can speak, before they can think, before they can consent or object, or even form the concept of themselves as something separate from the world around them, that question was left, quietly, in the dark. Why? Not why the public missed it. Populations are busy, lives are short, abstractions are hard. But why did the architects of these systems not feel the need to justify it? Why did the framing stay so relentlessly practical, so insistently administrative, when the infrastructure being assembled was so vastly larger than any of those practical justifications required? I have no clean answer to that. But I know that when powerful people build powerful systems and then frame them in the most limited possible terms, it is rarely because the limited framing is the true one. I keep returning to the coordination problem because it is to me the intellectually irreducible core of everything I've described. Not the existence of birth certificates, not the legal theory of personhood, not even the expansion of the state's administrative reach into the most intimate moment of human life, the instant of birth. All of those things have partial explanations. All of them can be attributed, with some effort, to the natural pressures of industrial society, the genuine demands of modern governance, the honest intentions of reformers who believed in data and science, and the power of government to improve human welfare. But the simultaneity, that is the thing that cannot be explained away. Nation after nation, different histories, different legal traditions, different languages, different governments, some monarchies, some republics, some colonial administrations, some in the middle of revolutionary upheaval. All of them arriving at essentially the same administrative architecture built on the same foundational logic within the same compressed 30-year window at the turn of the 20th century. And the architecture isn't just broadly similar. The underlying logic is identical. The individual as the unit of administration, not the household, not the family, not the community. the birth event as the initiating moment, the document as the legal anchor of identity, the number as the administrative handle, the state relationship as the primary relationship of recognized existence. These are not ideas that different societies would naturally invent independently and then happen to arrive at simultaneously. These are ideas that spread, that were shared. Through what channels, under whose guidance, driven by whose vision of how a modern society should account for its human beings, those questions don't have clean answers in the public record. And the absence of those answers in the public record is itself an answer of a kind. Before I leave you, I want to ask the question that haunts me most. Not about what was built, about what was replaced. In the world before registration, before the numbered document, before the legal persona, before the administrative ledger, how did people understand their presence in the world? The parish record, the village, the clan, the extended family, the community that simply knew you. These systems were flawed, often deeply unjust, often exclusionary, manipulated by local power, blind to those who didn't fit the expected categories. I am not romanticizing them. I am not suggesting we return to them, but they operated on a different principle. At their root, they were communal instruments. Your existence was confirmed through relationship, through belonging. The community knew you, the church community, the village, the people whose lives touched yours. You were real because they recognized you, not because a government recorded you. What the birth certificate replaced, or at minimum profoundly restructured, was that relational form of recognition. It substituted a state relationship for a communal one. It moved the axis of acknowledged existence from the human world to the administrative world. You were real now, not because people who loved you said so, but because a cleric filed a form and a number was assigned. That is a profound philosophical transformation in what it means to exist as a human being in a society. And it happened so quickly, so smoothly, so completely, that most people alive today have no living memory of any other possibility. The substitution is so total that it no longer feels like a substitution. It feels like the natural order of things, like breathing. That may be the most masterful aspect of the entire architecture. Here is where I have to leave you. Not because the story ends here, it doesn't. It extends forward into Social Security numbers now issued before children leave the hospital, into digital identity systems being assembled at this moment by governments and corporations operating in an intimacy of interests that should alarm anyone paying attention, into the question of what it means when the foundational document of your legal existence is held, ultimately, not by you, but by the state that issued it, and can, in principle, be modified, restricted, revoked. But I leave you here because the most important questions are the ones that remain open, suspended, unresolved. Why in the span of 30 years did every industrialized nation on Earth build the same system? Who decided that the individual human body, not the household,